Welcome back to the Fishing Daily podcast. This is the first episode in Series 5. And for this show, I'd like to welcome Dr. Ciaran Kelly from the Marine Institute. And we'll be talking about the Marine Institute itself and the stockbook and other things that's happening throughout the year for the institution. Welcome, Dr. Kelly.
Thank you very much, Oliver. I'm a long-time listener and first-time contributor to the show, so I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you very much. That's good news that our loyal listeners on with us. And Dr. Kelly, can you explain to us what is your role within the Marine Institute?
Yeah, I'm a director at the Institute of a service area called Fisheries and Ecosystem Advisory Services. That's one of 6 service areas in the Marine Institute, and we deal primarily with fisheries assessments and advice, as well as advice on the impacts of fishing on the marine environment. We provide information and scientific advice to the government departments, the general public and the industry. And essentially, that's all done to support the implementation of policies such as the Common Fisheries Policy or Marine Strategy Framework Directive.
The Institute itself, can you give us like a brief overview of what a year is like for it?
Sure. So the Institute work is very, very broad. I'm not sure if people understand the full breadth of what the Institute does, but it's involved in everything from maritime development, and that's through an office called the Maritime Development Office, for funding of marine research, so we're a marine research funder, performing oceanographic research, which involves modelling, through to seafood safety testing, which we're a statutory laboratory for, and in my service area on fisheries and ecosystem research advice. So I'll focus in on what our service area does because I couldn't describe in detail all of the work at the Institute. But for example, if we take fisheries and ecosystem advisory services, we're involved in research work, which is year round. So we have projects looking at subjects as diverse as long-term ecological changes, cumulative effects of ecosystem pressures, and even novel aquaculture methods on things like seaweeds and that. Um, on the fisheries side of it, the fisheries assessment program has a kind of a yearly pattern into it. So it typically begins with data preparation for ICES assessment working groups. ICES is the International Council for the Exploration of the Seas. The first of those is in March. That's the Herring Assessment Working Group. Then by May, we have the Celtic Seas Working Group, where we're assessing the major whitefish stocks around Ireland. And then later on in the year, we have other major pelagic stocks assessed at another working group called WG Wide. That's the widely distributed one dealing with mackerel, horse mackerel, and boarfish. And NEFROPS is also done at the other end of the year. So by June, we're working with our ICES colleagues in drafting the advice, and that's usually released on the 31st of June. In September, the pelagic advice is developed and the NEFROPS advice is developed, and mixed fisheries is released in October. So that's the cycle in sort of assessment work. But all throughout the year, we're sampling in the ports as well. We have bases basically at Dunmore East, Castletown, Rossaveel, Killybegs, and Greencastle. Processing of those samples happens in the ports, but it also happens at our headquarters in Rinville, just outside Galway here. And we also undertake surveys throughout the year. So those surveys begin with one called the IAMS, the International Anglerfish and Megrim Survey. That's a groundfish survey starting off the west coast of Scotland and working down around Ireland. We also have an acoustic survey for blue whiting that's out in March and April this year. And this year particularly, it only happens every 3 years. We have the egg surveys. They're triennial egg surveys targeting mackerel and horse mackerel eggs. We have a broad scale survey which provides information on boarfish amongst other species. That's on in June. We call that one West Pass. And then from May, we have several surveys on razorfish and cockles. In August, we have a new survey, but we only started off last year, called Ice Eco. And that's basically an ecological survey in the inshore areas. We're chartering small commercial boats to do that. And that's targeting juvenile fish close to the coast, from the southeast right away around to the west coast. The NEFROPS Borough Count surveys start in July and continue through August, working their way from the Irish Sea around through the Smalls and the Labadee into the Celtic Sea and out onto the Porcupine and Arran grounds. And then in October, we have an acoustic survey in the Celtic Sea targeting herring and sprat. And immediately after that, we run a 4-week demersal survey. It's actually a 5-week nearly, called the IBTS, and that's the big groundfish survey. that runs right up to Christmas. So after the first round of that advice is released in July, we start to work on the stock book. The EU negotiations start from late summer, and although they really don't pick up until October, we're continually responding to queries from the department, that's DAFM, who are involved in those negotiations. The pelagic negotiations start at NIAF coastal states. There's bilaterals, EU, UK, EU, Norway, and trilateral negotiations, EU, UK, and Norway. And they really pick up after September. So our role there is to provide scientific support to the department that are involved in those. And then by late November, we're kind of compiling the stock book. It's nearly completed at that stage. And then we get to December Council, where that information is to hand as a reference to support the sustainability statement, which is made to the Oireachtas, and to support the department and the industry in dealing with the proposals for the fishing opportunities for the next year. So a busy year.
Yeah, it's one of the most important aspects of all the research for the fishermen is when the stock book comes out. And we've heard how the stock book comes about through all that research. How many people is involved with it?
Basically, this year we've had a team of about 16 scientists. And when I say this year's stock book, which was produced in 2024, of course, we're now into 25, so we're beginning another cycle. But it's about 16 scientists, and that's reviewing the advice that's developed over the year. But at that stage, it's actually working on the back of information that's gathered by all the other scientists. So there's a team of about 50 covering that stuff that I was mentioning beforehand, which is sampling in the ports, going out in the scientific surveys, putting the information together for the stock assessments. So once that process is completed and the advice is done, there's a team of about 16 that are working on the stock book preparation. They're not working in isolation. They're working with their ICES colleagues for most of the year, but we're providing this as a lens for Ireland to look at the information from an Irish context, because the advice is given in a Northeast Atlantic context in terms of the advice. Um, so that's really what we do. I mean, in terms of compiling the stock book as well, previously we used to have a phone app that we used along with it called the Shiny app for the stock book. And that was so successful that ICES took over the role of that. And they've developed something called Advice Explorer now, which is available on the ICES website. So in this year, in Stockbook in 2024, that is, we introduced a new medium called the Stockbook Stories. That was on the basis of an idea proposed by Damien Turner. We went down to the South and West and we had a meeting with Patrick Murphy and his colleagues in the South and West. And we were talking about advice at that point. And Damien said, I'd love to hear it from the scientist's mouth rather than just read it in a big book. So this year we recorded a series of short video explainers. And that's the scientists themselves talking about what's going on with each of the individual stocks. So we'll release that in kind of social media. It'll be on the Marine Institute's YouTube page. And if that proves popular, we might extend that out for next year.
That's a very innovative idea because, it helps break down what is a lot of very technical aspects of the stock book. Say when you're gathering information, say for a species such as mackerel, what's the process?
So essentially, the information that goes into an assessment is compiled of two different sort of baskets. One of them is called fisheries dependent information. And the fisheries dependent information is critically important. And that comes from the fishery. So the first piece of that is the volume of the catch. And of course, for mackerel, that volume of the catch would include not just the Irish catches, but all the catches right the way around. But then we sample the catch. So when we're down in the ports or we're out at sea sampling the catch, that is also to record other information, which is called fisheries independent information or fisheries dependent information, excuse me. And that's length and age and weight at age, okay, and maturity of the stock. And all of those are really important because it's not just the volume of the fish that's used for the assessment, but it's what's called numbers at age. And the numbers at age multiplied by the weight at age actually gives you, when you sum it up, the total biomass of the stock. So fishery stock assessment is really a little bit like accountancy. It's kind of adding things up from that basis. It's backward pointing, which is a good thing and a bad thing. It's the way the assessments have to work because we remeasure things every year and then we refine our measurements on things every year, but we back calculate what the stock size must have been to give rise to the catches in any particular year, given the abundance of those different age groups as we go through. So that's the way it works with mackerel. And in principle, it's very similar for most other species that have that kind of an assessment on them, which will be an age-based assessment.
Yes, very interesting seeing some of the activity that research activity that has been undertaken, especially some of them in relation to like nephrops, where they're doing surveys with the cameras.
Yes.
And how important is that aspect of being able to understand the environment that the fish are living in and the changes that's happening around them?
Well, nephrops is a very unique example of a type of assessment and a type of survey that leads to an assessment. So in the case of nephrops, those TV surveys, we call them nephrops underwater TV surveys, or they're really burrow surveys. Uh, as I say, is a unique method of actually working out the size of the nephrops stock. And the way it's done is those TV cameras. We've been at the cutting edge. There's a scientist here called Colm Lorden, who's actually currently over working for ICES on secondment as the head of the advisory committee over there. But Colm and his colleagues in ICES kind of developed this technology a good while ago to put TV cameras down and essentially count burrows. But when you're counting burrows, not every burrow is a nephrops. A nephrops usually has two holes in a burrow, but sometimes they can have networks of more than two holes on them. And you need a lot of experience. We tried to automate this, and we've been trying to do it all the time to get a computer to read what the scientists would read as you would go along in a transect counting burrows. And it's proven to be incredibly difficult. And that's because the images are not always of a even quality, but also because of the complexity of what the human eye can understand when it looks at these images. But essentially what you do there is you count the burrows and you can translate the burrow counts into individual nephrops counts. And then through the same means as we talked about for mackerel, and this is sampling of the catch as well, you can work out the average size of the nephrops in terms of the weight. So you can multiply the numbers by the weight, and that will bring you back to a biomass of the stock. So every year that those underwater TV surveys are done for nephrops, they're covering the nephrops fishing grounds. And the nephrops fishing grounds are quite specific because they're a certain type of mud. You know, if the mud is too hard or if it's too stony, the nephrops can't burrow into it, and their food sources doesn't move over it in a fashion that they can feed off of. So nephrops have a very specific type of habitat, and we would notice as we go down there over the years subtle changes to the ground, the bottom type. So in some cases, you can have big storms. There was a case for the Arran grounds there a number of years back. I can't remember which storm it was, but it moved a lot of mud around on the seabed. So where these nephrops mud beds are, if they're susceptible to wave action over the top, that means that the mud can get moved around underneath it. And the fishermen would have reported the same thing. The nephrops catches there fell off after a few years after that storm because mud was moved and essentially the habitat was buried under a huge mound of what was there with nephrops burrows beforehand. So these things do change, but we keep an eye on them as they change, and we account for that in the way we do the estimates.
Nephrops are very interesting. I was watching a short clip on them a couple of weeks ago, and just to watch how they jump out of the burrows, and that's the time that you can catch them. Most of the other time they're within the burrows, and only come out unless they have to feed. And that's the interaction that they have in their environment is amazing. Does the rest of the fish have interactions like that?
With the environment, yes, they do, but not as specific and as regular as nephrops. So, like all fish species, for example, if you went to do a survey on cod, for example, and we don't do surveys specifically for cod, but they're caught in groundfish surveys, you'll be aware as well that under particular conditions, and the fish will move onto hard ground that you might not be able to catch them. So fish move around a lot depending on the availability of food, and food usually depends on habitat type. So cod being a predatory hunter, they're roaming over large and wide areas, and we can usually pick them up as an index. But from year to year, you'll see changes in that depending on what's happening in their environment, and they're just simply responding to their environment. Shoaling pelagic species are another one as well. If you do herring acoustic surveys, for example, and you're in areas with very high tidal runs on them, Think up in Lough Foyle, for example, up at the mouth of Lough Foyle. You can go in there on slack tides and you can see lots of herring marks because the herring are able to aggregate on the slack tides. And then if once the tide begins to run strong, if it's strong enough, no fish is going to waste its energy trying to stay together in a shoal against a strong running tide. So they'll move off and they'll break up at periods like that. And you have to have a certain amount of that in the back of your mind when you're designing these surveys, because they are susceptible to things like tide. Obviously, day and night, you see different behaviors in fish between daytime and nighttime. If you were doing an acoustic survey for something like sprat, you'll see sprat there in balls, sprat balls they call them, during the daytime when they're aggregated together, and then they're defending themselves against predators at that point. That's why they're in those shoals. But then during the nighttime, they can break up to feed, and the sprat will be much more dispersed in the water, and you won't see them acoustically as you can. So all types of fish behavior is taken into account on the surveys, but you can't account for every single movement of fish all the time. So it's generalized a bit too.
Yeah, it's a very complex area, and it's and adding to that complexity is the fact that it's all underwater, where you can't you don't have a clear view of what's happening. The more information that's been gathered, the greater the understanding. And I suppose an area now that ICES has been starting to look at is how can recreational fishers or fishermen contribute to the accumulation of information on fish stocks. How would that work in Ireland?
I think, first of all, recreational catches have not traditionally been included in the assessments for stocks. Well, first of all, they're not included for stocks that are not caught recreationally. So things like monkfish and megrim and hake and stuff that are simply not taken online, you don't have that data, and you wouldn't get it if you went looking for it. There's other stocks, of course, like salmon, we were talking about previously, sea trout and sea bass, where the primary source of data for the assessment is recreational fisheries because they're predominantly recreational fisheries catches. But then you've got the other mixed bag of things. So there are other species that can be caught by line, things like cod or pollock, for example. And you might say, well, why have the recreational catches not been included in the assessment? So ICES is moving to include those recreational catches. And traditionally, what had happened, of course, was the bulk of the catch was coming from the commercial fisheries. So when the bulk of the catch is coming from the commercial fisheries, you're only missing a small component if you don't have the recreational fisheries data in there. It's a part of the catch of the fish, but it may not be significant if it's tiny. However, when the tax get very low, and this is the case, for example, with cod and pollock and things like that now, um, when those catches get low, the proportion of the catch coming from recreational fisheries is now not an insignificant thing. It could be a much more significant thing. So in those cases, what we've got is we've got programs to gather that data. So we have under the ICES, or not the ICES, the DCF program, the Data Collection Framework program, a sampling arrangement with IFI, for example, Inland Fisheries Ireland. And Inland Fisheries Ireland would look at trying to gather some of that data coming through. So they would look in the first instance at coastal surveys, and these are just simply samples of what's going on around the coast from anglers by simply talking to them, to commercial recreational angling boats where they can get more aligned data. But it's a cost benefit program at the end of the day, Oliver. So if you have a very dispersed uh, area of capture of fish, it becomes very difficult and expensive to capture that data. But as that data becomes more important in the assessment, particularly where the commercial landings are becoming lower and the recreational data is making a more significant component of the overall catch, then it's required for that. So there's movements in ICES, and that's why you see ICES putting together these groups at the moment to try and figure out how to better capture that data, and most importantly, how to capture that data in a consistent way.
Another area that we hear people talking a lot about is in the area of climate change and global warming and warming waters. How much an impact is that having on fish stocks in Irish waters?
Well, it's undoubtedly having some impact. You'd have to say that. But what we're about in fish stock assessment is quantifying impacts. And most stock assessments are done on an annual basis. And the impact that you would see for climate effects, it would be very difficult to detect them annually. These things are decadal and multi-decadal. So what that means is that that impact is cumulative over a long number of years. So everybody thinks about climate change currently as unidirectional. Okay. Global warming is a typical example of that. So the world is getting warmer, the sea is getting warmer, therefore the impact must be linear and unidirectional in the same way. And of course, what you see when you begin to look at that and measure it, it's like an onion, you're peeling off layers and layers, is it's not necessarily, the signal is not necessarily as even as you might want to see. And there was a project done, Professor David Reed, that used to work here in the Institute. He's moved to ICES now as well. Did a project in the Irish Sea with a workshop called WK Irish. He was actually working with the fishing industry for that as well. And they looked at some of these decadal scale processes. And what they were looking at was particularly changes in productivity. And you could see that in the Irish Sea. But the interesting thing is, it's not necessarily unidirectional. So it changes. It goes up and it goes down. Okay. And that's typically the kind of effects that you see in a marine environment. You'll see changes happening in one direction and then back in the other direction. And that's because they're impacted not just by a temperature change in the ocean. The temperature change is the first part of that key, but it's the interaction between that temperature change and all the other ecological processes that eventually lead up to the abundance of a particular species. And that can follow in a almost in a chaotic way, not quite chaotic, but almost in a chaotic way. So it depends now on second order interactions between the environment, which is the physical heat of the ocean, the movement of that heat around the ocean basin. So there are things like eddies and currents, and the timing of those. And the timing of those movements of that energy in the sea is not predictable, certainly as we'd have it at the moment in terms of biology. They're predictable physically. So you can see how those eddies and currents will lead to things like heat waves. And how those heat waves happen is an accumulation of an input such as heat, and then a response to the movement of that heat, which would be the circulation and the ocean pattern current. So if you have slack waters or not very much energy on the ocean surface, that leads to that heat not being dispersed, then you get something such as a heat wave. And when those heat waves become extreme, and we're beginning to see these more now, they can have more extreme impacts on us. So at a very extreme level, fish will not persist physiologically in waters which are too warm. But long, long before that ever occurs, you have all these second and third order interactions, which is that heat causing either a productivity increase or decrease, or a predator increase or decrease, or a timing match or mismatch in terms of the food availability. So figuring out these things on an annual basis is well beyond the order of what we can do at the moment. But in the cases such as what was done in the Irish Sea, we can see these trends happening. And my point is that those trends are not just unidirectional. So one of the things we do know is that colder water species, so we would call things like cod, particularly cod, herring to an extent as well, of course. Herring and cod are pretty much at the southern end of their distribution in the Celtic Sea. Okay, so you don't get herring, you move into another species called sardine once you move down into Biscay, and you don't have very many cod in Biscay at all. So those fish are adapted for a colder environment. Okay, so their food and energy needs are supplied through the ecosystem that survives and thrives in colder waters. So they're at the edge of their existence in the Celtic Sea. And it's no surprise that as the Celtic Sea is warming up, which it is, and we've monitored that, those species are finding it more difficult. And it's not that they can't survive down there, but it's that it's just another stress to add on to all the other stressors they have in their existence. So at a certain point, you'll get a tipping point where those species can't simply persist and thrive. And they might not go extinct in those areas, but they might become very rare, so that they don't produce the large populations that they did. So their productivity is at a lower level.
The shift of the fish stocks is quite interesting. And in the 1950s, here where we're based here in Downings, there was a pilchard fisheries, and there's never been pilchard since. What could cause an event like that?
I could speculate, and I'd only be speculating, because I can tell you that there were pilchard fisheries around the west coast and the south coast as well. And now we're seeing currently much more pilchard or sardine on the south coast. We've also got anchovy on the south coast as well that we've been picking up in our acoustic surveys in increasing abundance over the last decade. So what causes that to happen? It's opportunity. Okay. So you need the opportunity. In the first instance, there needs to be either input from larvae or juvenile fish that end up in that area for some reason. How could they end up in that area? Sometimes they end up in that area because neighboring populations expand. They're doing very well. The juveniles move out through feeding competition, or maybe the adults migrate because of feeding competition. And when they end up in another area, if that area is suitable for their life needs, so for reproductive needs, for example, or for feeding needs, or because it's got less predators, they'll persist in that area. So you can get events, for example, it seemed to happen in the North Sea with horse mackerel. There's a very large stock of horse mackerel, which is a widely distributed stock across the whole northeast Atlantic. Uh, and the North Sea stock was at a low level, and then there was a huge outburst of horse mackerel back in 1982, a massive recruitment event, and that happened through a coincidence of factors that caused basically horse mackerel to have a very successful year for their spawn. Um, and from that, the sort of the you can see the echo of that northeast Atlantic horse mackerel outburst in the North Sea, and it persisted in the North Sea. But since then, the North Sea, its demographics in terms of how successful it is at reproducing from year to year, is independent and follows a different signal from the rest of the northeast Atlantic. And genetically, you would say that they're not, in fact, the same stock at all, but there is interaction between them. And again, the genetics is a very interesting component because once you peel back, how different is different? That's another one. All fish of the same species are, the same species. Okay, so they're genetically shared that amount of information, but individual populations can become separated, and if they become separated enough over time, and we're talking about geological time here now, not years that you and I are used to, they can become genetically distinct then at that point. So the North Sea stock was genetically distinct from the Northeast Atlantic in the case of horse mackerel, but you can see events shadowing between the two of them. I'm not necessarily saying that the same fish have moved from one area to another, but simply the environment that has changed over a wider scale benefits small populations as well as large populations, and they can grow. Fish populations can grow from very small levels to inhabit an area and persist for a period of time.
Yes, it's very interesting what fish populations, how they can grow and how they can shrink and sometimes disappear and come back again. I suppose an example for that in Irish waters has been bluefin tuna in recent years. And suppose the reason maybe why they're moving in is because there's more of abundance of different sorts of fish for them to go after.
Yeah, so again, it's a combination of things there. So what we were talking about beforehand was the persistence of individual localized populations in an area. In the case of bluefin tuna, they're widely distributed. I mean, these are huge animals roaming over an enormous area. We have satellite tags. We've been tagging tuna in the Marine Institute with satellite tags for a good number of years now. And we've seen them over a full year and the movements they make. And an individual fish, for example, tagged in Irish, what we call Irish waters, or let's say, in Donegal Bay, could end up moving down to the Azores at one point of the year, moving back into the Mediterranean at another point of the year, coming out of the Mediterranean and coming back up along Biscay, up off the coast of Ireland, returning back to the same point nearly where it was tagged, and then maybe heading off further north up as far as Norway and back. So bluefin tuna roam very widely. And as the bluefin tuna stock, I mean, was large, and it was back in the 1990s and early noughties, we were involved in the institute and BIM, our colleagues in BIM, trying to work with Japanese longliners as it was at the time, observing the catches, and they've been longlining for bluefin tuna out beyond the Irish 200-mile EZ for a number of years, and they were interested in moving inside in Irish waters. And at that point, Ireland became interested in looking at the movement of and the presence of bluefin tuna inside in the Irish 200-mile EZ, and then come along 2010s and 2015s and up as far as nearly 2020, the bluefin tuna stock declined and they disappeared, or at least they weren't noticed as frequently in our waters. And then, lo and behold, over the last 5 to 10 years, they have come back again in increasing abundance. And so we have this increased focus on bluefin tuna again. So there's two things happening. At the one point, the stock itself is expanding, so there's more fish around, so more fish end up in our waters. And the other reason, of course, is fish don't come to Ireland on holidays, lovely and all as it is, and I'm sure the sea is as well, but they come for food. And you're right, Oliver, of course. The reason they're there is because they're feeding. These are large predators. They need a fairly large input of prey species to keep them going, and they will persist in areas where there's sufficient abundance of those prey species. So they're back feeding, and you can see that that bluefin tuna is quite spectacular feeding process. You know, they'll breach the water and everything as they're chasing down the smaller prey species that they hunt. And they are in abundance in our waters. We've been tagging them now with our colleagues in IFI as well.
Say for a species that's not migratory, is there a possibility that when there's an explosion of that fish stock, that it could actually damage itself by having too many numbers in it?
That's an interesting question, because what you mean by damage, I'm not sure, because fish populations will basically manage. When I say manage themselves, they manage within the environment that they're in. So there's a concept in fisheries science called MSY, maximum sustainable yield, and that concept shows that if a fish population was left to its own devices, it would achieve a biomass called BMSY. This is a biomass that basically a virgin population would have without any fishing. And then as you fish that population, essentially there's an element of increasing the productivity in the fish. So the fish population, its reproductive capacity is essentially constrained by the energy available around it, and that's somewhat based on its predators, but also based on its food resources. Okay, so it cannot extend beyond the energy inputs that it has. As you begin to fish that population and you reduce its pressure, for example, on the prey that it consumes, you can actually get a greater productivity rate in the fish stock by doing that. Um, but when fish populations come through, many of them reproduce differently. So some fish stocks, for example, are adapted. They invest a lot of energy in their young, so they produce relatively few young. Elastobrine species are typical of that. Those produce either individual egg cases or, in some cases, pups. Okay, so they actually give birth to live pups. Um, and they're much more analogous to things like mammals that we're used to on land, where their productivity is very small. Most other fish species produce by broadcasting their spawn in the sea, so they're somewhat susceptible to the environment. Once they're there as eggs, they produce orders of magnitude more eggs than they have larvae, and those larvae have orders of magnitude more abundance than our juveniles that recruit to the fish stock. So those are much more susceptible to environmental inputs, and the environmental inputs will be things like the physical survivorship of those eggs and larvae, and that's due to predation, but also due to the food that's available to them. And also kind of the temperatures and where they end up. So if they drift to an area, for example, where there's no food available for them, they'll fall off and die. And some of the oceanic fish populations that you have, and boarfish would be a typical example of this, they seem to have they're like, what would you call them, the sort of the poppies of the fish world. You know, poppies will invade a new space very, very quickly. They're adapted to colonize open ground essentially, and there seems to be some adaptation in boarfish to be able to do this, because we see the boarfish populations change very quickly, so they can go from relatively, I won't say not abundant, but at a level of abundance, to a much higher level of abundance, and very quickly too. Even though boarfish actually interesting live for quite a long time, they can live for up to 20 years. Most of the population is not in that age group at all. So some species will adapt very, very quickly, but when they adapt very quickly, that happens in two directions. So they can increase their numbers very quickly, and then as they run out of food, that natural food availability will decrease their numbers as well. And then, of course, fishing is another layer of unnatural, but it's a predation. It's a type of predation that occurs on top of that. So it's not part of their natural environment, but it's just a proxy for another predator that's there on them. Fishing normally concentrates on the adult fish, so that's what we try and manage when we're giving advice on fisheries.
As I said before, it's a very interesting, very complex topic, and we could discuss more and more layers of it. I'd like to have you back in so we could talk about it in more depth, because it's such a deep topic on every single species that you could nearly have an individual podcast in every one. The next question I have for you, Dr. Kelly, is what is the projects that you've lined up for 2025?
So on just talking about species specific ones now. So as I indicated at the outset, we're involved in research, which is ongoing throughout the year, and then we have specific stock assessment kind of cycle that we go through. So for 2025, what's on our radar essentially is pollock. So pollock, there's a major effort going on in data gathering and analysis on pollock, which is hopefully going to lead to a second benchmark. A benchmark is the assessment that ICES does that kind of draws the line under how you do this assessment going forward. So we're going to try and go back and produce a better assessment for pollock. There's a number of issues there that we're looking at. We're looking at everything from the biology of them. So that is how they reproduce and the productivity of them and the length and weight, but also the populations themselves. So we had a bit of a discussion earlier about populations and why they persist in areas. So pollock is an interesting one because from an ICES perspective, it's the one fish stock of pollock from the west of Scotland right the way down through to the north coast of France. That's a very big area. Most people that would be used to pollock would see pollock in a much more regionalized context, even to the extent of, bays and much more localized areas. So there's been work which started off in 2023, actually, went on throughout 2024, and will hopefully reach its fruition in 2025, which is looking at the stock structure of pollock, and that's looking at the genetics of them. So that's the lens that we have to basically establish whether or not pollock is a single stock across all that areas. Despite the fact of ICES giving advice of it being a single stock, by the way, there are two TACs set for pollock, one for west of Scotland and one for further south in Area 7. But they're both assessed as a single stock. So that's one area of specific work we'll have in projects for 2025. We're also going to move our lens back onto sprat as well. Sprat fisheries are coming back into focus too with the volume of landings in more recent years. We've been gathering information on sprat and we've been doing research on sprat for a number of years. And we're going to bring that to a head because I think sprat is one of these areas where the ICES advice isn't particularly useful. And also, there's no TAC set by the European Commission on sprat, and that's because predominantly the sprat fisheries are much more localized. The union is much more interested in setting TACs for stocks which are shared within the union member states. Um, but the sprat stock that we have is another one where we can look at the stock identity as well. That's considered as one stock right the way around the Irish coast. Now, interestingly, you have a separate stock of sprat in the Channel. So if there's a separate stock of sprat in the Channel, then why would the Irish Sea be the same stock as Donegal Bay and the southwest of Ireland? So we have some genetics that we've been working on for a number of years, and we're hoping to bring that to a fore in 2025. We've also done a lot of work looking at the input information. We talked beforehand about fisheries independent information surveys, and our surveys for herring in the Celtic Sea also pick up sprat. The way you have to look at sprat data, though, is slightly different because the sprat breaks up at nighttime predominantly. So we have to go back and we can do this now because that's the beauty of digital virtual information. We can rerun all our surveys and just look at it in daytime only to figure out an abundance estimate for sprat from those surveys. And hopefully we're heading towards producing a better assessment and giving a better advice for sprat. And that will look at two things. One of them, whether or not and what is a stock for sprat around the coast, and then also what's the change in abundance of sprat. In 2025, we'll also be looking at tuna. So we'll be continuing our tuna satellite tagging program. That goes on every year and will continue. And the tuna chart program, which is run with our partners in IFI, will also continue on that. Then we have like research on, we didn't talk about it on this podcast at all, Oliver, but we do research in aquaculture as well. So seaweed aquaculture is coming into the interest, and we've got a project that's just started up on that, and we'll be continuing on that in 2025. Beyond that, we have a basket of externally funded research projects that include bycatch monitoring methods, impacts of fishing on the seabed, potentials for sustainable mesopelagic fisheries, integrated ecosystem assessments, understanding the ocean carbon sink and its interaction with fishing, impacts of climate change on biodiversity that we were talking about earlier on, and the evaluation of the establishment of marine protected areas. So, like any of those, you could have an individual podcast on, but we're involved in research across all those areas. And the reason that we do that is to try and get out ahead of the advisory need. So we know, for example, that the issue of carbon sinks and fishing, it's been topical, but it's going to come back to the fore as countries struggle about what to do with their carbon targets. Um, Integrated ecosystem assessments are becoming much more important because the interactions that we were talking about beforehand about the climate and multiple species interacting with each other in that changing climate and how that affects productivity on those fish stocks. At the moment, we deal with fisheries and fish stocks in a singular sense. So we give advice on cod and herring and whiting and pollock. But there's an interaction between those species, and that's looked at from an integrated ecosystem assessment point of view. How you translate that into an advice is a very difficult issue at the moment. But ICES, and we are working with ICES, we're trying to lead the field in ICES and basically work in that way. So that's what's on the table for 2025.
It's a busy year
A
again.
busy year, a busy year, but we've got a good team here. We've got a good team, and they're an experienced team at this point. And the driving force really within the Institute is to keep this stuff relevant. So we're doing nothing if we're not adding value, Oliver. That's our kind of motivation for doing this. So we need to, whatever we do from a scientific perspective, it's not just researching things for the sake of doing it. It's researching things from the point of view of doing better science to support sustainability. And that sustainability is for the fishing industry, and it's the impacts of fishing on that biodiversity as well. So what the fishing industry want to see and what the Marine Institute is interested in supporting is the sustainability of fishing going forward. And that's our job, is to provide that advice.
How can young people get involved with the Marine Institute and marine science?
So we have a series of programs at the moment, and they start in primary school. So we have this program, it's an outreach program really, called the Explorers Program. And that's a teaching aid to national school teachers to introduce kids to marine science. And it includes all sorts of interesting things like, seashore experiments and what happens under various different ways, and even using teaching maths through the sort of the lens of marine science. So that's much more an outreach and an education exercise. We have in the local area here around Rinville, many of the scientists go out because their kids are in the local schools, and they go out and they talk to the schools about, what mommy or daddy does. And that's one element of outreach too. But as you move on then into second level, we have a transition year program. Now, at the moment, our transition year program is we bring the students in over a couple of weeks. There's not very many of them that we can accommodate, and we give them a taster of what the Marine Institute does. But you can see from what we talked about at the top of this podcast that the Marine Institute does an awful lot. So sometimes when those students come in, it's like they're drinking from a hose. They're just looking at everything and they're going, there's too much going on here and not enough to focus. So I had the privilege, actually, I went up to Moore with the department and the minister, who met with Muireann Kavanagh and her father. And we had a chat. We were having a chat about pollock and trying to understand the science on pollock. And Muireann sparked a sort of a thought in my head that we might be able to look at that TY program and get more specific on it. And that is bringing kids before they get to second or third level in universities and try and give them a little bit better understanding of how the science works. Muireann was very inspiring, actually, in her passion and her motivation for what she was talking about, and I could see there's, Muireann is one great example. There's lots more young individuals in Ireland that are interested, like Muireann is, about a future for the marine, and they need to get access to that information at an earlier stage. So we're going to look into that. She was the spark to basically look at that TY program and see if we can make it more specific. We don't have that yet, but we're going to look at that in 25. And then for young people, as they move into college, we have a bursary scheme. We have the Marine Institute bursary schemes where students can come and get work experience in the Marine Institute for up to 16 weeks on a variety of activities. That's a great scheme. It's been run for decades at this point. And we'll be running it again. The calls will be out in 2025 shortly, and those calls go out through the universities, and you can apply to be part of that scheme. And the great thing is, if you get work experience, you get paid, for that work experience while you're in college. That's generally during the summer months that happens. And then as you move on to university, for the university graduates, I talked about the Marine Institute actually funds research as well. So we have scholarships for PhDs and for postdocs too, which are advertised every year. So we do that as well. And that's basically our basket of interaction with the youth. So some work done and more work to do.
We'd like to have you back again sometime and discuss maybe another topic that you'd like to get into more depth in. And we'd be glad to have you here anytime.
For sure. And I'd love to come back another time as well.
Thank you, Dr. Kelly.
Thank you very much, Oliver.
Fishing Daily Podcast was produced by Cholat Conversaja and Talia in 2025. The music is by Oliver McBride. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like and subscribe as it helps us greatly. And thank you for listening.